Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see so many of you piling into our event this afternoon. We still aren't quite up to full numbers. However, I'd just like to wish you all a very warm welcome. I'm Tracy Ruddle and I work for Birmingham Education Partnership. And with over 250 of you requesting to be part of this webinar at this point in the academic year is really fantastic that you found the time to attend, and so that's just wonderful. Just so that you all know, we are going to be recording this session so that if you're watching something and you wanted to share it with other staff at a later date, you will be able to. And Deb has also very kindly said that we can share her slides as well. So all of those will be available on our website at the end of the session. We don't have the Q&A function this afternoon for questions, so we are inviting you to put your questions in the chat. I've got some very able people sat in the background who hopefully are going to be able to pull common questions together for me so that I don't lose it in a myriad of questions, but we will do our very best on that one. While we're still waiting for just a few more people to turn up, I'd just like to mention to you about a free webinar that is on Thursday at 3:45 to 4:45, being hosted by Little Sutton English Hub. And it's on the revised letters and sounds, the phonics program, Little Wandle. And I think you would find that really useful. Those of you that went to the presentation that Little Sutton have been running on early reading, we're sure that you're going to get a lot from that. And I will mention it again at the end of the session in case you haven't had a chance, but you'll find the details on Little Sutton English Hub, and it's Little Wandle, Letters and Sounds Revised. So if you are, interested in that, there are still slots available for you. So with no further ado, it is time now to introduce Deb Jenkins. Deb is one of Her Majesty's inspectors, and prior to working with Ofsted, she was a head teacher for 10 years in 2 different special schools and also holds her NPQH. She's taught in both mainstream and special schools in primary and secondary phases, and has also worked in a local authority as a numeracy strategy consultant to pupils with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. And that is absolutely Deb's specific expertise. So Deb, we are really pleased to invite you here, and hopefully any technicalities that we're having issues with, we'll try and sort out. But Deb, it's over to you, and hopefully we're going to have 30 minutes from Deb and then time to pick up your questions at the end. So all questions in chat. Deb, over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see so many people who've taken the time to join this webinar at such a busy time of year. I remember how that was, so I feel your pain. So without further ado, we're going to make a start on the presentation, which is about the Education Inspection Framework, SEND, and Curriculum Adjustment, High Aspirations for All Pupils. So throughout the presentation, I'm going to be referring to 2 key documents, and I'm sure you're familiar with both of these. First of all, there's the School Inspection Handbook, and that's the April 2021 version, and then the Special Educational Needs and Disability Code of Practice 0 to 25 years. Now, that's the statutory guidance for organisations which work with and support children and young people who have SEND. Now, you may well be aware that the government launched the SEND review in September 2019 because they wanted to look at how SEND arrangements have evolved since 2014 and to make sure that these reforms are being implemented as well as possible. And that review was also planned to help inform the revision of the SEND Code of Practice. Now, both of these events were due to happen in 2020. However, something got in the way, as I know you're all aware, and everything was delayed because of the pandemic. We were actually expecting the review to be published at the end of June, and I think Gavin Williamson did indicate that it was going to be published this year, but the latest news is that that has been pushed back again, and we don't yet have a date for publication. And of course, that's going to impact on the review of the Code of Practice as well. So for now, we're going to be continuing with the current documentation. So, key questions that I would like you to consider, and we're going to think about what is adjustment, what is that high quality and ambitious provision for pupils, and what are those key components of that inclusive curriculum. Now, I would like you to use these questions as a springboard for the consideration of your own school approach. There is no preferred approach expected by Ofsted, so I hope that this will enable you to reflect on your current practice in school in the context of these legislative frameworks. So before we think about adjustment, what are those basic expectations for schools? The Code of Practice sets out clearly that where a pupil is identified as having special educational needs, that school should take account to remove those barriers to learning and put effective special educational provision in place. Now, that support should take the form of a 4-part cycle through which early decisions and actions are revisited, refined, and revised with a growing understanding of the pupil's needs and the support the pupil needs to make good progress and secure good outcomes. You will have heard of this as the graduated approach. So what is adjustment? Well, a useful definition, as you can see on the slide, would be a small alteration or movement made to achieve a desired fit, appearance, or result. So when we're considering that high quality provision and ambitious curriculum for children and young people with SEND, we're looking at those small adjustments to provision. And those adjustments might be in terms of pedagogy, it might be in terms of your approach to how you implement your curriculum, perhaps providing pre-teaching, reinforcement of concepts, so that those pupils can access quality first curriculum implementation rather than a series of interventions or catch-up systems. So what it isn't about is about knocking down the current curriculum and providing something completely different. Doing something different is going to lead to different outcomes, which might not help pupils to the same ambitions as their peers. For many years now, we've seen the impact of offering something different. And as far back as 2010, Ofsted released a review into SEND provision that found that as many as half of all pupils identified for school action would not be identified as having special educational needs if schools focused on improving teaching and learning for all. By providing something different, individual needs were actually increased, and many young people who should not have been identified as having special needs were. What we saw was an over-identification of SEND. More recently, the HMCI, Amanda Spielman, has talked about the protective benefits of a high-quality education. That is, the things that, when done well, prevent children and young people's needs from escalating so that they need something additional or different. So my initial question to you when considering the provision for children and young people with SEND at your school is, does your realised definition of adjustment overcome barriers to learning for SEND, or does it create barriers? I now want to move on to that high quality provision and ambitious curriculum that underpins this presentation. The Education Inspection Framework, which came into use in September 2019, makes it crystal clear that SEND is a golden thread throughout an inspection, not just a bolt-on. And as you will see from paragraph 194 in the handbook, the effectiveness of SEND provision is evaluated before that final overall effectiveness judgment. In fact, before any final judgments are made, the inspection team will consider the provision for those with SEND. We are aware that although the Education Inspection Framework is now nearly 2 years old, the reality is that inspections were suspended in March 2020 because of the pandemic, so only a limited number of schools will have had first-hand experience of being inspected under the new framework. So in considering what an ambitious provision and curriculum looks like, I want to reflect closely on the things we said in the SEND briefings in November and December last year. These briefings are essential reading for all of us, and they're available on the gov.uk website. It would be unrealistic to consider any type of high quality provision and ambitious curriculum without considering the impact of the pandemic. When thinking about the curriculum at the moment, schools need to be mindful of the reality for many children and young people with SEND over the last year or so. And then taking this information into consideration, I really want to focus on what schools need to ask of their own settings when considering that high quality aspirational curriculum and provision. So what has it been like? Well, you've lived it for the last 18 months, so you know exactly what it's been like. But what impact has it had on children and young people with SEND? Because actually we know from the research that they have struggled. Many young people are further behind as a result of disruption to essential education, health and care services, and some may have new or emerging needs which have not been identified or assessed. Children and young people with SEND have been affected in widely different ways. Those pupils described as SEND support, and there's around 1 million of them, were not included in the government's definition of vulnerable, and as a result may have missed out on that additional help and support they had previously been receiving in school. Many children and young people with education, health and care plans have been absent from school for significant periods of time during the pandemic, and their experience of remote education has been mixed. During our autumn term interim visits, school leaders told us that children and young people's physical and mental health have worsened during the pandemic. Some have regressed in important areas such as communication and physical development. Poverty has become a bigger problem for more families during the period of national restrictions, with many more families now facing major financial difficulties. And older pupils are worried about their lack of education at a crucial time in their lives and what this means for their next steps. Quite simply put, as a result of the pandemic, never in our recent history has the importance of a high quality provision and ambitious curriculum meant so much for so many young people with SEND. So it's now essential that schools and settings provide a culture and environment for inclusion, identify, assess and review SEND and barriers to learning, and provide an ambitious curriculum and curriculum implementation. So let's be clear about who we're talking about. And I think we have a problem with over and under identification at the same time. Too many children and young people are identified as having SEND when their difficulties arise from weaknesses in the curriculum and teaching. But at the same time, some needs, such as mild to moderate hearing loss or speech, language and communication needs, are not identified in an accurate or timely way. We need to be clear that those children and young people who have fallen behind or work at just a different pace to others do not necessarily have SEND. We are talking about those who need something additional to help them achieve the same outcomes as their peers. Those who have very clear barriers that need support to overcome them. Those for whom learning would not happen unless something additional was provided for them. So let's just think about those definitions. So what are special educational needs and or disabilities? Well, it can be one or the other. In a smaller number of cases, could be more than just an SEN or a disability. But the Children and Families Bill makes it very clear that a child or young person does not have a learning difficulty or disability solely because the language in which he or she will be taught is different from a language which is or has been spoken at home. So those pupils with EAL don't necessarily have to go straight onto your SEN list. The Code of Practice also identifies that behavioural difficulties don't necessarily mean that a child has a SEND. The code does make it clear, though, that when behaviour is consistently disruptive or a child has become withdrawn, this can be a sign of unmet SEND. Way back in 1978, and some of you might remember this, the Warnock report initially estimated that 20% of children during their time at school might experience a special educational need that would need additional educational provision to be made. So what is the provision in place to meet the special needs of the pupils at your setting? The Code of Practice makes it clear that a child or young person has SEN if they have a learning difficulty or disability which calls for special educational provision to be made for them. They have a learning difficulty or disability if they have a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age, or they have a disability which prevents or hinders them from making use of facilities of a kind generally provided for others of the same age in a mainstream school or a post-16 institution. I need to stress here that high aspirations for all pupils is not just a case of well-planned lessons, although of course they do play a part. It's also about the culture and commitment of the whole school to being ambitious for children and young people with SEND. So on inspection, when making judgments about the quality of education, inspectors will consider the extent to which schools are equipping pupils with the knowledge and cultural capital they need to succeed in life. Our understanding of knowledge and cultural capital is derived from the following wording in the national curriculum, and that is essential knowledge that pupils need to be educated citizens, introducing them to the best that has been thought and said, and helping to engender an appreciation of human creativity and achievement. So what does that commitment look like in terms of processes? We want to see teachers enabling pupils to understand key concepts, presenting information clearly and encouraging appropriate discussion. We want teachers to check pupils' understanding effectively and identify and correct misunderstandings. And we want to make sure that teachers make sure that pupils embed key concepts in their long-term memory and apply them fluently. So you can see quite clearly from the School Inspection Handbook that when we consider inspections of schools, this commitment to that environment for inclusion shines through those key statements and judgments. It's that golden thread. But of course, that commitment is evident not only in the inspection framework, but in the Code of Practice, as you'll see from extracts on this slide. It's clearly the case that any curriculum that is ambitious for children and young people with SEND needs to find its home in an environment for inclusion that's based on a culture of commitment and ambition for those vulnerable pupils. As I said earlier, it's not a bolt-on approach. So rather than me telling you what you need to think about in the context of inclusion, I want to pose the following questions of your own environment for inclusion. So have a look at these questions and think, do you feel that in your school there is work to be done, or are you confident that your environment for inclusion is committed to an ambition for all children and young people with SEND? So when that environment is in place, what next? Well, this is probably one of the most important slides in this session, and it's about overcoming barriers to learning. Take your minds back to the start of the session when I focused on getting you to consider understanding pupils with SEND in your school. Are your SEND children there because they've fallen behind, because they need to catch up, or because they've perhaps not had the best quality teaching in the past? Or do they have those key barriers that if nothing additional was provided, they would not progress at all? The key point I'm trying to make here is that anyone who has a difficulty with learning needs the best thought out and the best taught curriculum. We also need to think about the impact for pupils in terms of knowing more, remembering more, and being able to do more. And those other dimensions of progress, such as increasing pupils' accuracy, fluency, automaticity, confidence, independence, and ability to transfer and generalize. And this is where the importance of content selection and sequencing is key. You'll probably be familiar with the intent, implementation, and impact terms in your curriculum, which sit very clearly in the handbook. And on inspection, inspectors will consider the extent to which your curriculum sets out the knowledge and skills that pupils will gain at each stage, and we call that the intent. We will also consider the way that the curriculum has been developed or adopted by your school and the way it's taught and assessed in order to support pupils to build their knowledge and to apply that knowledge as skills. And that stage we call implementation. And finally, we'll consider the outcomes that pupils achieve as a result of the education they have received. And of course, we call this impact. So we'll want to draw some evidence about your curriculum intent from discussion with you, and we'll explore things like how carefully you've thought about the endpoints that the curriculum is building towards, what pupils will be able to know and do at those endpoints, and how you've planned the curriculum accordingly, how you're going to address those gaps in pupils' knowledge and skills, how you've sequenced the curriculum to enable pupils to build their knowledge and skills toward those agreed endpoints, how you've made sure that the subject curriculum contains content that has been identified as most useful, and make sure that this content is taught in a logical progression, systematically and explicitly enough for all pupils to acquire the intended knowledge and skills. And of course, how the curriculum has been designed and taught so that pupils are able to read at an age-appropriate level. In terms of the graduated approach, the assess, plan, do, review, the code of practice makes it clear that the class teacher or the subject teacher working with the SENCO should carry out that clear analysis of the pupil's needs. And that should draw on teachers' assessment and experience of the pupil and use other information such as progress and attainment and behaviour. That assessment needs to be reviewed regularly, and it will help ensure that support and intervention are matched to need, barriers to learning are identified and overcome, and there is a clear picture of the interventions put in place and their effect is developed. Sometimes you will have outside professionals from health or social services who may be involved with the child, and it's really important that these professionals liaise with the school to help inform those assessments. When planning that provision, parents must be formally notified. All teachers and support staff who work with the pupil should be made aware of the pupil's needs, the outcomes sought, the support provided, and any particular teaching strategies or approaches that are required. And when you're doing it, getting that work done, the class or subject teacher should remain responsible for working with the child on a daily basis. Even where there are interventions which involve group or one-to-one teaching away from the main class or subject teacher, that class or subject teacher should still retain responsibility for the pupil. They should work closely with any teaching assistants or specialist staff involved to plan and assess the impact of that support and interventions, and more importantly, how they can be linked to classroom teaching. The effectiveness of the support and interventions and their impact on pupils' progress should be reviewed in line with the date that you've agreed. And of course, it's really important to gather the views of pupils and their parents. And those of you who may work in special will know that as a very bare minimum, there must be an annual review of a pupil's education, health and care plan. So this diagram illustrates the graduated approach. So just take a minute to consider it in relation to the practice in your school. Is there anything that raises questions for you about these different stages? It might also feel familiar to you, and if so, that's great. All good curriculum implementation practice includes elements of the graduated approach, and good practitioners will often instinctively apply it in their work. Applying it in practice will enable you to develop a continuously improving understanding of needs, effective provision, and progress among the pupils you teach. And when we're considering inspections of schools and settings, this commitment to overcoming barriers to learning shines through the key statements and judgments. I just want to draw your attention to something on this slide, and you can see that it says the curriculum is successfully adapted, designed or developed to be ambitious and meet the needs of pupils with SEND. So we've talked about adaptation, but I want to pose a question for you here. How often is your curriculum for a subject developed with the key thought of SEND included? How often do subject leaders plan a curriculum and share their development with the SENCO? What is the profile of SEND in curriculum development? Is it there at the start or during, or is it something that's very much thought about afterwards? And again, you can see how the code of practice relates very clearly to the education inspection framework. Schools must use their best endeavours to make sure that a child with SEND gets the support they need. So it's clearly the case that any curriculum that is ambitious for children and young people with SEND is based on a culture of commitment and ambition for those vulnerable pupils. So again, rather than telling you what you need to do, I want you to pose the following questions of your own strategies in school for overcoming those barriers to learning. In asking those questions, do you feel that there's work to be done? Or are you confident that your ability to overcome barriers is committed to an ambition for all children and young people with SEND? So take a minute just to look at those questions in the context of your own school and see whether it helps you think about something that you might want to go back and take forward. So now I want to pose the following question of your own systems for quality first curriculum implementation. In asking those questions, do you feel that there's work to be done, or are you confident that your ability to implement a high quality, ambitious curriculum is committed to an ambition for all children and young people with SEND? And you'll see from the slide that the top bullet is highlighted. And that's because it's really important that the school consider where SEND fits in terms of curriculum development. Is it there at the start, or is it something that you do once the curriculum is in place? I hope that this presentation has given you the opportunity to reflect on the practice in your own school. Often schools are working so hard, but they can be working in isolation, and you don't get a sense of what is going on in other schools. So with this in mind, I just want to talk briefly about Ofsted's recent research project supporting SEND, which was published in May 2021. Now, this was a qualitative case study which took place just before the pandemic and involved 21 pupils in 7 mainstream schools. So it was a very small sample and results are not generalisable, but I think it does provide some useful information for us all to consider. The research found that schools often took a pupil-centred approach when identifying needs and planning provision, but staff didn't always know those pupils well enough, especially those pupils without education, health and care plans, or pupils were sometimes less well known to SENCOs. Pupils with SEND were spending time out of class working with teaching assistants, but there were some concerns raised about social exclusion and an over-reliance on a single adult. So these pupils are spending large amount of times with less qualified staff rather than teachers. So were those pupils getting access to high quality teaching? Is that something that you need to consider in your own provision? What about curriculum training for support staff as well as teachers? TAs need a good subject knowledge to deliver intervention activities. Is there an over-reliance on teaching assistants? And are pupils taken out of class so much for support that they're becoming socially excluded from their peers? The research found that on some occasions the curriculum was not properly sequenced or matched to pupils' needs. Because of missed learning or unmet needs, some pupils didn't have the foundational knowledge and skills and didn't have the chance to master those basics. Where collaboration was strong, pupils' needs were better met. parents that the research team spoke to felt that they didn't have enough information about their child's learning and development or opportunities to contribute to support plans. In fact, some pupils didn't have a support plan at all, which showed that that graduated approach wasn't in place. It's a challenging time for SENCOs, and they have a crucial intermediary role, but often they don't have enough time to do their job. A few SENCOs in the research study were full-time class teachers, which demonstrated that those schools didn't prioritise their role. As well, SENCOs expressed frustration over bureaucracy, over referrals, EHCPs, and the length of time it took to take those to come through. Schools were employing a wide range of tailored strategies to meet people's needs and were sometimes supported by multi-agency services. Strategies such as adapting teaching, providing specialised resources, subject-specific interventions, quiet places, and strong support for transition were seen. Local authorities also had strong ambitions for multi-agency collaboration, but this didn't always translate into improved practice and positive experiences for schools and families, such as long waiting times and high levels of bureaucracy. And I think many of our area SEND inspections have highlighted that these are particular concerns for families and schools. Some pupils were getting support from external services, but maybe not to the extent they needed. And that lack of timely access or access to the full range of support meant that some families resorted to paying for services themselves. So the research raised general questions based on the findings, and it appears that some pupils are getting a good deal, but others less so. What does success look like, though, for pupils with SEND in mainstream schools? And why is success reliant on individuals in individual schools rather than an effective system? I want to finish this presentation and encourage you to reflect on the current provision for pupils with SEND at your school. Do they have special needs? Do they have SEND? Let's be clear about the difference. We will all at some point in our lives have some kind of special need, whether it be as a result of a trauma or incident that has temporarily affected our ability to function. This might result in reasonable adjustments to our lives and working patterns to affect how we function. However, do they have a long-term impact on our ability to access learning? Knowing and understanding the difference is key when considering your provision and curriculum for children and young people with SEND. Are all pupils with SEND included in all aspects of the education provision of the school? Remember, at the beginning of the session, we spoke about when Ofsted come to making judgments, one of the last things before those judgments are outlined is the consideration of the extent to which the school's education provision meets different people's needs, including pupils with SEND. And as we know, provision applies to so much more than the curriculum. It applies to early years, the sixth form, personal development, and leadership and management. So does the teaching of your curriculum in your school overcome or create barriers to learning? The essence of this session has been about adapting. Do your adaptations support young people with SEND to achieve what their peers will do, or does it provide something completely different, which will in turn lead to different outcomes? And I'd just like to finish with this analogy. We've all been faced with times when we've been on a train or getting ready to get on a train, and that fateful announcement comes that there'll be a bus replacement service because something has disrupted the journey. We ideally want to be on the same train as it will get us there faster, in more comfort and with less stress. However, on this occasion, we need to get on the bus. While the bus might look great and it's really easy to get on and feel comfortable, it's not the train. It's slower and it will only get you to the final destination in a much slower way. And it's often driven by someone who doesn't know where you want to go ultimately because they only know the next station they'd normally be going to. You want to be on the train because that gets you there faster, in more comfort and with less stress. If you get to that interim station, your journey on the bus might have been nice and trouble-free, but if you're going to get where you want to, you need to be back on that train. And that's exactly the same for children and young people with special needs. The train journey is the provision and the high expectations that all of their peers will be having. The alternative bus route is a choice. Yes, there will be time when people are getting to know their needs, accurately assessing and implementing them, but the focus must be to put the right provision in place to get them into the expectations that their peers are accessing, to get them back on the train. Staying on the bus is not an option. It's symptomatic of low expectations and a lack of focus. It's not adapting, it's something different with different outcomes. High Aspirations for all pupils is about keeping all children on the train for the longest time possible so they can achieve the best possible outcomes. So that's the end of the presentation. Tracy, I'm going to come across to you now to see if there are any questions. And I will say, if I can't answer your question, I will certainly make sure that I find somebody who can, and I'll feed that back to you.
Well, Deb, thank you so much. I just found that fascinating. And we've got a couple of questions already. I'm sure more will come in as we're going through these. But I'd like to kind of kick off with one of my questions, really, which is when we spoke, I think it was you referred to it on your slide 21 about children knowing more and remembering more. And one of the things that we generally find with our SEND pupils is their struggles to retain, it's particularly long term. So what do effective strategies look like from your point of view? Well,
there's no big secret, there's no special mysterious answer. It's basically revisiting, and we can all think about something in our lives when we start to learn a new skill, and it may be about perhaps learning to drive. So you get in the car and everything feels very strange and very different, and you have to think it through and you have to keep practicing until you get better at the driving. But you keep going and you keep going until the point at which you get into the car and you don't have to think, I've got to put my foot on the clutch, I've got to take the handbrake off, I've got to look in the mirror. It becomes automatic. So that constant revisit, recall is so important for all pupils, but particularly for children and young people with SEND, it's even more crucial. You've got to do it more and more and more.
And are there, I'm just following up on that one, Deb, because are there particular ways that we should be, rather than, I get it's all about knowledge, but how do we, are there strategies for helping with this long-term stuff other than repetition? Is there something, are there particular things we should be doing with children to help kind of stretch their minds in that way?
I think you've got to find an approach that suits that particular child, because different approaches will work for different children. We all know there are some children that pick things up quickly and then other children that take longer, or a specific approach that works for a child. So you've got to find the right approach that works for that specific child. And if something doesn't work, try it a different way. Don't give up, try it a different way, because I think all too often we're very quick to blame the child. Oh, well, they just don't get it, they don't understand it. Well, actually, let's think about putting it in a different way so that they can understand it and they can get it, and we can revisit it. It's no good doing something, for a week every year and expecting those children to remember it. It's not going to happen. It wouldn't happen for us, so it's not going to happen for them.
Thanks, Deb. Utterly fascinating. Just when you partway through your presentation, and Bethany asked about, you talked about the over-identification quite at the beginning of your presentation. The over-identification of SEND be explained. Is this the general consensus, or are we actually seeing an increase in the number of children being identified?
I think historically there's been an over-identification. I think schools are now getting better at identifying pupils. What we've seen particularly in the recent past is specifically an over-identification of pupils with moderate learning difficulties. And I think then that relates back to what I talked about in terms of maybe they've missed out on quality teaching, they haven't grasped some concepts. So all of a sudden they've been given a label of moderate learning difficulties rather than unpicking the real reasons for why they are where they are. So that high number of pupils identified with moderate learning difficulties, they may not actually have those moderate learning difficulties. It could be as a result of the gaps in their learning and the support that they didn't have earlier on in their school career.
Yeah, and then Claire asked a question around, she asked if a child has a diagnosis, say ADHD or ASC, but they don't require any additional provision, should they be on the SEN register?
Well, if that's a tricky one, isn't it? Because if they've been diagnosed, then that would suggest that there is something that they need help with, and that may be with a pupil with ADHD. It may be to provide specific strategies to support them in class. It may be an oversight of their medical needs. For a child who's been diagnosed with ASC, they have particular impairments in areas of thought. So I would say actually that they do need some additional provision to really address those specific areas. So make sure that you get a really accurate assessment of those pupils to find out where those gaps are in their learning and in their approach to learning, so that you can make sure that you plug them. And it's not to say that you put a child on your register or whatever you want to call it, that they're there forevermore. Those strategies might be successful in that, you now don't need to make additional provision, but be very clear from the outset that if they've got a diagnosis of need, then there's going to be a reason behind the fact that they were identified in the first place.
Thank you. And, I was fascinated by your comment about how often is the curriculum planned with SEND pupils in mind. And so I'm thinking, I'm putting myself back into my head teacher days. How do we ensure that we don't water it down to just simply make it accessible? What do teachers, what do curriculum leaders need to be juggling to get that level right?
I think you're right, and I think some schools perhaps haven't thought about this, and I think it's something that schools do need to think about moving forward. And I know a lot of schools have taken the time, particularly during the pandemic, to really revisit and rewrite their curriculum, but putting SEND at the heart of that. But of course, it's about identifying what are those key outcomes for those young people, because there might not be the same range of outcomes that you want other pupils to achieve, but you've got to be specific about those key outcomes and make sure that they are aspirational, that you're not lowering the bar for those pupils because they've got SEND. So, just keeping those standards as high as possible, but really focusing on what are the most important things that those children need to learn.
Thanks, Devon. And so, if you were seeing, this is what a good one looks like,
Yeah.
How would different provision look that you would think that's a really great case of, a different but highly effective provision?
Yeah, I think your curriculum model would need to be strong to make sure that there's a good sequence of content, that content is revisited regularly over time. This isn't a case of we'll do a week of fractions in the spring term and then we'll never visit fractions again, because most of the pupils are going to struggle with that, and your SEND pupils are going to struggle with that even more. So making sure that there's constant opportunities to revisit learning and then build on that learning. And I've forgotten the second bit of your question. I do apologise.
I'm just looking back because I was scribbling all the time that you were talking, to be honest with you. We were talking about oh gosh, I can't find it now. Oh yes, a good example of different provision.
Yeah, so I think being very clear about your outcomes and expectations for all the pupils, and then within that, how is that going to be adapted for those pupils with SEND? So as I said, rather than that bolt-on approach, oh, this is the curriculum for most of the children and then this is what we're going to do for the SEND, actually this is the curriculum for everybody, and then how are we going to adapt it for those pupils with SEND so that the curriculum sits at the heart of the practice and the adaptations come for those pupils in terms of specific areas that they need support in.
And as we were thinking that one through as well, I was thinking about your, I thought it was just such a brilliant question. And I know that if you'd have been at my school looking with this lens 10 years ago, I would have failed miserably because you were talking about
sure, that's not the case.
The definition of adjustment, creating barriers or removing them. So just kind of tease out for us, please, that, what might an adjustment that creates a barrier look like?
Oh, that's a really good question. Let me think. Perhaps an adjustment would be, say, a pupil with a difficulty managing their behaviour. We're going to make sure that they have a separate playtime so that they don't have an impact on other pupils. Well, actually, you're creating another barrier because you're reducing that pupil's opportunity to engage with other pupils, to actually then learn to regulate their behaviour.
Fine. And so for that same pupil then, what would be helping to remove that barrier? What would you expect, say, a school to be doing with a child that is really struggling and parental complaints are pouring in every time he or she sets foot on the playground?
I think being very clear about what's expected with the pupil, sharing that information with the pupil and the parents, thinking about specific strategies that you might use. So it may be that you have a small amount of time on the playground to begin with, and then build that time up gradually, making sure that the pupil's getting lots of positive praise for their good behaviour, engaging them in activities so they don't get the chance to be distracted to go and upset other people, or their behaviour just starts to deteriorate. Just making sure that those pupils have those quick wins and those successes so that you can build on that in incremental steps over time.
And then I know it's something that's, we know that many SEND pupils are often excluded or certainly fixed term, but in terms of children having a slow reintegration back into school and that type of thing, how is that perceived?
We part-time timetables shouldn't really be used. They can be used, but only for a short period of time. So we would say that if you have a child on a reintegration programme returning to school, that needs to be very carefully planned, and it needs to be reviewed regularly, at least every couple of weeks, because that pupil has a statutory entitlement to a full-time education, and so they need to be in school. But you've got to plan that reintegration carefully.
And you mentioned about the pandemic. In terms of blended learning, what have you noticed that SEND children have had a particularly raw deal in this?
Yes, we have noticed that, and I would say, there've been some real positive examples of support for pupils with SEND, especially where teachers and teaching assistants have built up those relationships with those children, and some pupils have actually loved being at home and working remotely because it really suits their learning style. So some of them have had a great deal. Others, those perhaps who are at earlier stages of development, have struggled because the style of learning and the learning activities that they need to do are very practically based, so it's quite difficult to replicate those in the home, and particularly those children with more complex difficulties who really rely heavily on adult support and adult intervention. You can't get that via a screen, so those pupils that have missed out particularly.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because we had across the city, we've got a number of AP provisions, And a number of those, they were older admittedly, but a number of those students reported that they preferred to be at home connecting via this type of mechanism where it wasn't quite the close proximity, where there weren't people who could upset them.
That's right, yeah.
So that it is fascinating, isn't it, that actually for some children it did work quite well.
And again, I think it just shows that there isn't that one size fits all. You know, it is very much a planned approach according to different needs. And it's not going to suit everybody. And it's the same in terms of provision for SEND. You know, it's not one particular approach that is going to work. It's about what that particular child needs. So that's why the initial identification and assessment is so important.
And then I have the privilege of going to Special Forum, and so I work with head teachers who represent children with all of whom have EHCP plans. I'm using the wrong letters, I'm so sorry.
No, you're right, EHC plans, yeah. Or EHCPs, as we call them, yeah.
What you're talking about now. But, you know, even within that, do you expect SEND pupils? So I'm talking about maybe some of our visually impaired children, some of our deaf children, or some children with autism. Might you expect to see additional provision there specifically too?
Absolutely. And when we inspect schools, we will always look at some samples of education, health and care plans, because they set out quite clearly the additional provision that those pupils will need. And sometimes we do find that individual education plans are very much just focused on improvements in English and maths, and they forget to look at simple things like positioning of a child. So for example, a child with a visual impairment should never be sat facing a window, because they're not going to be able to see what's in front of them because of the glare from the window. And often those kind of little things get missed because we're too focused on, you know, learning our 6 times table. Well, that's not additional to what that pupil needs, because all of the pupils need to learn their 6 times table. It's what is additional for that child that needs to be put in place, and that should be writ large really in that education, health and care plan.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, everyone. I've been monopolising that whole conversation with Deb.
That's okay.
But are there any more questions? No, none coming in. If some come in the next couple of seconds, that's absolutely fine, and we'll pick it up with Deb. I mean, Deb, I just thought that was utterly fascinating. And a massive thank you for doing that for us.
Thank you, Tracy, and thanks to everyone for sticking with it as well.
Yeah, well, lots of people are making sure that we can have the PowerPoint and that they can have the recording. And yes, the answer to both of those is yes. Tomorrow morning they'll be on our website. We'll try and get them on our homepage so you can quickly access them, because I don't know about you, but I would really like to watch it again and kind of just drill down. And Deb has said she's more than happy to answer questions. You can either send them via us and we can collate them for her. But we are going to ask you for evaluations of the event. When we come off, we'll just send you some. It is really helpful for us to know that we're doing the right thing for you. And just, also, yeah.
Sorry, Tracy, I was also going to say that if anybody has got any suggestions for any other presentations that we can do from a SEND perspective, do let us know, because we'd be happy to help with that.
Yeah, and we're really keen to continue with these next term. And so, you know, if there's a particular focus you want Deb to look at, or one of the HMI team, they absolutely will help. I mean, all of this has come out because we know what you need to focus on. And finally, just before we all go, one final plug for Little Sutton English Hub. There is the Letters and Sounds revised webinar going on this Thursday, 3:45 to 4:45. It's called Little Wandle. It's on the English Hub, Little Sutton English Hub website. Go on and have a look. Really interesting. And Jane has just said she would be really interested in differentiation of scaffolding. So there's something we can think about as we're moving forward. Okay.
Thank you, Tracy. Can I just say as well, thank you, Tracy, so much. It's been a pleasure to join your platform. So, and I hope that people have found it helpful.
Oh, the comments are flying in on the chat, Deb. You honestly, you have earned a glass of wine this evening.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, have a good evening, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.